A type triangle is a term that describes a trio of typings, where each type is super effective against the next one in the cycle. Water, Fire, Grass is the most recognizable, as it's the decision that starts off almost every Pokemon journey, as well as starting a lot of arguments online. While the starter trio is the prime example, there's actually quite a few type triangles in the franchise, with 16 in total at the time of this recording. I have to say that because I can't guarantee what the new DLC will bring, so here's hoping I'm not immediately wrong. Since Game Freak doesn't do a great job of showcasing all these trios, today I'll be going over every type triangle that currently exists, that way you can have even more of your brain space occupied by the franchise. And by the end of the video, we might even have a prime contender for a new starter trio. That is, if Pokemon ever decides to give the fans something unique, which they probably won't. Before we get started, be sure to drop a like down below and subscribe for more Pokemon content. My dog and I would both appreciate it. To start going over type triangles, we first need to break them up into 3 different categories. These 3 are perfect, imperfect, and monotype. Starting with perfect triangles, let's go back to Water, Fire, Grass. This trio is considered perfect because not only do they make a super effective loop, they also resist the type they're super effective against. The important detail here is that no type has an inherent advantage over any of the others. Outside of Water, Fire, Grass, there are only 3 other perfect type triangles, which we'll get to in a bit. Meanwhile, 10 of them can be considered imperfect triangles. As the name suggests, these trios don't have that perfect chain of resistances like their counterparts. A great example of this is our second triangle, Psychic, Fighting, Dark. This is probably the second most recognizable triangle, as it was the additional type trio that the X and Y starters had once they were fully evolved. The reason this triangle is imperfect is because Dark is immune to Psychic. Even though the resistances work otherwise, it means Psychic has the biggest disadvantage of the 3. You may not choose to hit your opponent for not very effective damage, but that's still better than not hitting them at all. The last category is monotype triangles, of which there are 2, Ghost and Dragon. Quite simply, since these types are super effective against themselves, they can make a type triangle. However, they can also make type squares, pentagons, or even just lines. I find these ones interesting because you can argue they're also perfect triangles. Sure, they don't have that chain of resistances, but you can't say that one has an advantage over the other. When I was looking at the list of type triangles, one big thing jumped out to me, and that's how many trios include both grass and rock. The reason these 2 are so common together is because every type that rock hits for super effective just so happens to hit grass for super effective. This means grass and rock work in 4 different triangles: grass, rock, fire, grass, rock, ice, grass, rock, bug, and grass, rock, flying. Unfortunately, all of these triangles are imperfect since grass doesn't resist rock. In the case of the trio with ice, it's even worse since it doesn't resist anything but itself. Poor ice type, forever doomed to imperfection. Of these 4 triangles, I want to spend a moment talking about the one with flying. Flying is sort of a weird type. There are very few primary flying types in the franchise, with most of them being single-stage Pokemon. If you wanted to make this trio with evolutions and use a primary flying type, your only options are the Noivern line and the Corviknight line. But it's really only the Noivern line. Once your Corvisquire evolves into Corviknight, the triangle is broken since steel resists rock. So literally Noivern would be your only option. Of course, once you dip into secondary flying types, you've got every option possible, but it just goes to show that primary flying Pokemon are still very underutilized in this franchise. While Grass and Rock can only make imperfect triangles, if you trade out Rock for its close associate Ground type and add in Grass's final weakness of Poison, then you have our second perfect triangle. The notable type here is Poison, as this is the only triangle that actually uses it. Well, that is if you look at the current type chart. If you go back to the days of Gen 1, when Poison was super effective against Bug, you can actually create a triangle of Poison, Bug, and Psychic. That being said, if you watched my evolution of the type chart video, shameless plug, you know this trio is extremely unbalanced. But back to Grass, Ground, Poison, while this is a perfect trio, I think most of us would agree that Ground is the best choice. It hits the most things for super effective damage, and it's the only type to have an immunity. Not to mention, Grass and Poison don't have the best showings in the franchise. But to end on a more positive note, this would be a great trio to adopt a secondary type triangle such as Psychic, Dark, and Fighting. With Pokemon like Claydol, Toxicroak, and Cacturne, you could have quite the fun trio on your hands. Moving on to another imperfect triangle, here we have Water, Ground, Electric. This is Water type's only triangle outside of the starter trio, and while it may look nice, it's far from perfect. Specifically, Electric is at a big disadvantage. Not only is Ground immune to Electric, but both Ground and Water can hit the types behind them for neutral damage. This ends up leaving Electric in a pretty tough spot. Funny enough, I've actually seen this triangle used years ago. A friend of mine was playing on a hacked cartridge that had a starter trio of Squirtle, Trapinch, and Mareep. And is it just me, or is that a really weird trio? For one, the moment you evolve Trapinch, the triangle doesn't work anymore. But even more importantly, the evolution levels are all over the place. With all of these Pokemon at level 30, you'd have a Wartortle, you'd still have a Trapinch, and you'd already have an Ampharos. Definitely not balanced, which I guess means it represented the triangle pretty well. To continue, we're going to stick with the ground type, we'll freeze the water until it becomes ice, and use a few sparks of the electricity to start a fire, and here we have our next triangle. Now if we went back to Generation 1, this would be a very rare type triangle where none of the types actually resist each other. Still don't know why fire didn't resist ice in Gen 1, but that's besides the point. But in the modern day, ice is yet again at a big disadvantage compared to the others. Regardless, this would be a really cool trio as there's a lot of great options for Pokemon. Especially since you could use 2 Ninetales, or 2 Darmanitans, or 2 Marowaks, or 2 Sandslash, or 2 Castform, or 2— okay, I think he got stuck. Let's move on. We can actually make a new type triangle with what's here by replacing fire with steel. While still an imperfect triangle, as a trio without any of the starter typings, something about it just feels
nice.
This triangle could also bring attention to a lot of underrated Pokemon that I think deserve some more love. My personal favorite would be Bergmite, Mudbray, and Qfant, as you would end up with one of the heftiest starter trios imaginable. Oh, what starter did you pick? Oh, me? I chose Pikachu. He's just a cute little fella. What did you choose? Yeah, I went with a 10-foot tall, 1,500-pound steel elephant, something fit for a Chad like me, you know? The next type triangle is our third perfect one, being steel, rock, and fire. Off the bat, this would be a great trio for a volcanic region or even an industrial-based region. The trio of Klinklang, Garganacl, and Magmortar comes to mind, but there's plenty of good alternatives. You could even do a trio with only single-stage mons by using Earthworm, Stonejourner, and Heatmor, which, now looking at it, is probably the most disappointing trio you could ever be offered. The only other thing to note about this type triangle is that it's the only trio where every type shares a common weakness, being ground. If anything, this would work out really well for a game where the evil team specializes in the ground type. Honestly, the more I talk about it, the more I want this game. So to all you game developers watching, please jump on this. Speaking of game developers, a fellow content creator who goes by the name tyKenter is currently working on a project called Chat Makes a Pokemon Game. Tasty is creating a Pokemon fan game where you can directly contribute to what goes in the game just by hanging out in his stream. You can help create Fakemon, develop the story, submit an application to become a character in the game, and a whole lot more. This is a project with a lot of love and care behind it, and if you've ever wanted to help make a Pokemon fan game, there's never been a better opportunity. If you're interested or want more information, check out his latest video. Link is in the description. Seriously, it's a really cool project. But with that all said, let's get back to type triangles. With 3 triangles left to go, the next one is the only triangle to include the fairy type, being Steel, Fairy, Fighting. Yet another imperfect trio since fighting doesn't resist steel, this type triangle feels like a perfect trilogy of RPG characters. You have Fighting, which represents the Fighter/Barbarian category, Fairy, which fits nicely with the Mage or Cleric characters, and Steel, which can represent Knights or Paladins. If Pokemon ever decides to break from their standard setup and lean into traditional RPGs, this would easily be one of the coolest starter trios. Our penultimate type triangle is Flying, Fighting, Ice. Again, with the ice type involved, this is imperfect. But with one change, we can not only make it perfect, but we can make what I consider our top pick for a new starter trio. Flying, Fighting, Rock. Not only is this triangle perfect, but it's the only perfect type triangle that doesn't include either water, fire, or grass. More than anyone I've talked about, this is the one I want to see from Game Freak. I know it's unlikely they'll ever stray from water, fire, grass, but you could easily make this trio the secondary typings. And if you did that, then they'd all have 4 times weaknesses to the type before them. I'm just saying. And there you go, all 16 type triangles in Pokemon. That is, as long as we're talking about single typings. I can't even imagine the depth that would go into creating dual type triangles. Well, maybe one day. But for now, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more Pokemon content, and be sure to check out tyKenter's video down in the description. And while you do that, I'll get working on some more videos. So for now, as thanks for making it to the end of the video, here's a picture of my dog. Talk to y'all soon.